If you have your Bibles, turn to Hosea chapter 11, if you would. Hosea chapter 11. And we're kind of doing a little bit of a different message this morning. We're going to be looking at primarily one verse in Hosea 11 and then one verse in Matthew 2 with some surrounding context. But it's a little bit of a different message this morning, and I hope it would be encouragement to you. You are probably familiar with the saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. If you don't learn from the past, you are going to be condemned to repeat it, right? And the point is clear. We should learn from what has happened in the past. We should learn from history. So kids, if you have ever maybe touched a hot stove, what did you learn?
Pull back your hand.
Pull back your hand. If you've ever touched a hot stove, hopefully you have learned a lesson to not touch it again, right? And if you don't learn that lesson, you are condemned to repeat it again and again and again. That's not a good thing. But is that the only reason why history is helpful? Is that the only reason why history is helpful? Right? A lot of the Bible is made up of history. So is learning moral lessons? Oh, don't do that. Don't touch the hot stove, spiritually speaking, because look at history. Look at Israel. Look at God's people in the past. Is that the main point of history? Is the only point of, or the primary purpose of biblical history so that you would learn what to do and not do? No. Now, that's a helpful lesson. There are helpful things there in that regard to learn from Israel's history, to learn from their example. But that's not the only or primary purpose of biblical history. This morning, I want to look at one particular passage that is about Israel's history, but I want you to see how history gives hope. History gives hope. Now, I'm a little bit nervous because I know when I was a kid, history was boring. Capital B and several O's. And so I'm nervous because, for kids, you're like, uh-oh, I'm checking out, man. But you had an hour of extra sleep. So no excuses, all right? I want you to see history gives hope. Why? How? Because when you rightly understand God's works in the past, we don't just respond with thanksgiving about the past, but we also respond with hope. Why? Because if he did it once, he can do it again. If he loved his people enough to do it once, he still loves his people enough to do it again. So history gives hope. History gives hope. So Hosea 11, starting in verse 1, it says there, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Now let me ask you an obvious question. What is Hosea 11:1 talking about? Who is this son? Who is the son? In this context, who is the son here that is called out of Egypt? Israel. Israel. Now, I heard some of you give the Sunday school answer. You're like, it's Jesus. Because every answer is always Jesus. In this context, it is obviously Israel. It's obviously Israel. And it's talking about the past, right? When Israel was, past tense, a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. This is talking about the past. This is talking about Israel in the past. I called them out of Egypt. We call that the Exodus. We talked about that a couple years ago. If you weren't there for that, that's okay. We're doing a little review this morning. The Exodus was something in the past for Israel. Now, we are into November now. For some of you, the moment you get into November, that means it's time to decorate for Christmas. And you just skip right over Thanksgiving. I know. But with Christmas, maybe you take some time as a family to read through some of the gospel accounts of the birth of Christ, and perhaps you get to Matthew chapter 2. Now, keep a finger here in the book of Hosea, but turn to Matthew chapter 2. I know we're doing a little flipping today. It's a little bit different, but hopefully I trust this is green bean casserole. All right? Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2 talks about the birth of Christ, the visit of the wise men, and you get down to Matthew 2:13. Matthew 2:13. And it says, "Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him.' And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" Now, what's going on there? Herod, if you remember, Herod hears about this. The wise men come and say, "Oh yeah, there's a star. There's the king of the Jews who's born." And Herod's like, "Wait! I'm the king." So he makes this plan to murder all the baby boys under the age of 2. He makes a plan to murder all the baby boys, and Joseph is warned in a dream, "Leave, flee, go to Egypt where you'll be safe." And then it says this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. We know it's the prophet Hosea, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Matthew's clearly quoting Hosea 11:1, which was about Israel, but Matthew is saying this has something to do with Jesus. What gives? And now, just to not get too Bible nerdy on you, Bible nerds and scholars debate how in the world does this work. That was about Israel. Matthew says it's about Jesus. Was Hosea wrong? Was Matthew wrong? Is there something kind of crazy going on here? Because if that's the way that you read the Bible, then I don't know how to read my Old Testament. You can just kind of make things up. Biblical scholars debate these things. It's a little bit complicated. But I think it's actually really amazing when you put it all together. And so kids, if you're still with me, history gives you hope. And this is amazing. This is amazing. How should we understand this? How should we understand this? That's the question I want in the background. And now I'm going to walk through 3 points with you. And hopefully by the end, I hope, you say, "Wow." Not, "Huh?" So 3. Just wait till the end, Jude. Wait till the end. So 3 points. The pattern of salvation in the Exodus, the promise of salvation in the Exodus, and the provision of salvation in the new Exodus. The pattern of salvation, the promise of salvation, and the provision of salvation in the new Exodus. So first, the pattern of salvation in the Exodus. The pattern of salvation in the Exodus. Now, let me back up and just give some brief history. You remember that God had blessed his people, the descendants of Abraham. He said, "I'm going to give you this land, the promised land, but first, before you own this land, before you dwell in this land, you're going to be taken, you're going to go to a faraway land, and you're going to be slaves there. You're going to be taken captive as slaves there for 400 years, and then I will bring you back to this land." Well, God did that. Abraham and his descendants, they go down to Egypt during a time of famine. They multiply like crazy, and then Pharaoh, a new Pharaoh, rises up and is scared, so he enslaves the whole nation of Israel, turns them into slaves, and then you get the, Prince of Egypt, 10 Commandments, Charlton Heston, "Let my people go." 10 plagues, you get the Passover, you get the parting of the Red Sea, and the people of Israel go free. They are redeemed. The Old Testament uses the word redeem, and when it says redeem, to buy back, to purchase from slavery, the idea is the Exodus. Whenever you see the word redemption in the Old Testament, or really in the Bible, it has in the background the Exodus, being bought out of slavery to Egypt, and spiritually being bought out of slavery to sin, as a picture of that. And so, how did the Exodus happen? There were 10 plagues. The last plague, remember the last plague? Is the death of the firstborn, right? The death of the firstborn. And every firstborn in the whole land of Egypt is meant to die. Why? Because of sin. But how would the firstborn escape? By sacrificing a Passover lamb. Do you remember this? God says, "Look, Israel, you're going to take a lamb." Each family takes a lamb. And, lambs are cute, cuddly, cute things. Right, kids? If you, a lamb, so sweet, so innocent. Cats, evil, wicked. Lambs, just so precious, so precious. You have that lamb with you in your home for a few days. Why? So you build an emotional connection to it before you slaughter it. Okay, the Bible doesn't say that, but you keep it in your home for 3 days. And then at the end of those days, you slaughter the lamb. In Israel, you're to put the blood on the doorposts. And you're to eat the lamb, and you're to eat the lamb together as a meal, and you're to have your belt fastened, your shoes ready, because you're about to flee. You're about to be delivered out of Egypt. So you eat this ready to go. You eat this with the car all packed up, so to speak. And you've got blood on your door, and all throughout Egypt, the firstborn of every family dies, except for the families that have blood, the blood of an innocent lamb on the door. Right? Now, for us as New Testament Christians, you hear that. You already get the connections. You see it. But for them, this is the first time they've heard this. They have a Passover lamb. They eat the meat. The blood is on the doorway, and God passes over. And they're delivered. And the idea is this. You should die here too because of your sin, but the lamb dies in your place, in the place of the firstborn, and so you can go free because a lamb died in your place. You guys follow me? And then immediately after that, they go through the Red Sea. The waters part. They go through on dry land. And it's this amazing thing. They go and receive the law on Mount Sinai, and then they wander in the wilderness for 40 years, okay? Why am I talking about all that? Because you have to understand, in the Old Testament, for Israel, they were an Exodus-centered people. For them, salvation meant the Exodus. Redemption meant the Exodus. This was the high point for them. This was their moment that gave them identity. This is what defined them as a nation. And so, keep a finger here, and we're just turning all over here. Go back to Exodus 12. Go back to Exodus chapter 12, and I want you to see this. In Exodus 12, we get these instructions about the Passover lamb. And in verse 24 to 27, I love what it says here. Exodus 12, verse 24, it says, "You shall observe this rite," talking about Passover. "You shall observe this rite as a statute for you and for your sons forever. And when you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service. And when your children say to you, 'What do you mean by this service?' you shall say, 'It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. For he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians but spared our houses.' And the people bowed their heads and worshiped." The Passover was meant to be something they would do every year. Every year they were to celebrate the Passover, and they would do this thing where they would kill the lamb, and they would eat this meal. They would have unleavened bread. So no leaven. It would have to be new bread, unleavened, Passover lamb. And when the kids ask, "Why do we do this?" It's because it is the Lord's Passover, because he saved us out of slavery in Egypt. We're to do this every year to remember. We're to remember who we are, to remember what God has done. And I love that particular passage because I still remember the first time one of my kids sat with me and Abijah in a service where we had communion, because they were usually in children's ministry or nursery. And then the first time they were sitting in a service with us where we were celebrating communion rather, which is the New Testament version of Passover. Spoiler alert. That particular child was distraught about the injustice that we had a cracker and juice and he could not have it. Just distraught. And we were not ready for this. We had not thought about this. This is the first time he saw it. We were not ready for this. And this verse came to mind. They will indeed ask. And it gives us a teaching opportunity. It gives us a teaching opportunity. So when you see salvation in the Old Testament, it's all about the Exodus. There is sacrifice, the lamb. There's substitution, the lamb instead of the firstborn. There is deliverance from slavery. You pass through the waters. You receive the law. You have a relationship with God, and you live for him. The Exodus really paints a picture of the whole Christian life of salvation. And there's this theologian named Jim Hamilton who wrote this book about trying to summarize what is the main story of the whole Bible. If you had to summarize the whole Bible in one phrase, how would you do it? And his statement is this. The whole Bible is this. The message of the whole Bible is this. God's glory in salvation through judgment. God's glory in salvation through judgment. Not salvation just from judgment, but salvation through judgment. How do you figure? In the Exodus, God glorified himself. He made his name known to the whole world by saving Israel, not just from judgment, but through it. Through the Passover. Through the death of the firstborn, yet they were saved through it. Through the Red Sea, Pharaoh and his chariots were all overthrown and killed, and they were saved through judgment, not just from it. So we have this pattern of salvation in the Exodus. We are saved through judgment for the glory of God. There is substitution, there is sacrifice, there is deliverance, there's all these things. This is in the history of Israel, and they're meant to do Passover to remember, to remember, to remember. But here's the thing. We get to Hosea 11:1, and it says, "Out of Egypt I called my son." This is clearly a reference to the Exodus. It's actually probably a reference specifically to Exodus 4:22. "You shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son." There's a reference to that. Why, in the book of Hosea, does God speak through the prophet to remind them, "Out of Egypt I called my son"? Why? This gets to our second point, the promise of salvation in the Exodus. The promise of salvation in the Exodus. Why bring up the Exodus there? Why bring up history? It's because history gives hope. History gives hope. Throughout the book of Hosea, remember, God says through the prophet Hosea, "You have been unfaithful, Israel. You have been unfaithful, and judgment is coming. You've been unfaithful, judgment is coming. You're not going to go away to Egypt, you're going to go away to Assyria. Just as my people of old, when they went away, when they were exiled, when they were put into slavery, they went to Egypt. You won't go to Egypt, but you will go to Assyria." This is sort of like exile for them from the promised land. This is exile for them from the promised land. Assyria is like Egypt 2.0. You're about to be put out of the land, Israel. And in the midst of this, God says, "But I will bring you back. I will bring you back." And then he says, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. And if you were Israel at that time, you go, "Okay, what's the point? Why does that matter?" Let me give a different illustration for this. Imagine a set of parents, a mother and a father, they adopt a child. Imagine they adopt a child, and that child was living, prior to adoption, that child was living in just the worst of situations. Constant danger, constant malnourishment, no love, no care. And this child is hopeless and helpless. And this mother and this father, they see this child, they set their love on this child and say, "I will adopt this child. This child will be mine. This will be my son. Everything that is mine is going to be his. I love this son. I've adopted this son out of that misery." Now, just imagine with me that time goes on and that child from time to time has nightmares, remembers his childhood, remembers all the horrors that he witnessed and had to experience and live through. And he's worried, what if that happens again? What if I go through another situation or trial like that? What if somehow we get separated and I find myself in danger once again? And the father looks at the child and says, "When you were a child, I loved you, and I adopted you to myself. When you were a child, I loved you, and I called you to myself. When you were a child, I loved you, and I brought you to my family." What's the child going to think? This boy's not going to think, "Okay, yeah, but you did it once, but what does it have anything to do with now?" No. He understands. The point is, if you love me then, you'll love me again. You'll do it again. If you loved me then and you called me out, you adopted me out of my misery then, no matter where I find myself, you will come pursue me and save me again. You will call me out again. You will deliver me again. That's the idea. And so when God says to Israel, "When you were a child, I loved you, and out of Egypt I called my son," he's not just saying, remember the history. He's saying, have hope because I will do it again. You follow me? So there's the pattern of salvation in the Exodus, but there's also the promise of salvation. "I delivered you once from Egypt, but I will do it again." And that's why if you get to turn back to Hosea now, turn back to Hosea 11, I just want you to see some of the things that it says here in Hosea 11. Hosea 11, verses 1 to 5, it says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them by their arms, and they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke in their jaws, and I bent down to them and fed them. And verse 5, look at this. They shall not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria shall be their king, because they have refused to return to me. So he's saying it's like the Exodus again, except instead of Egypt, now it's Assyria. But it doesn't stop there. He says in verse 8, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? How can I judge you, essentially? How can I forsake you? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my burning anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not a man, the Holy One in your midst. I will not come in wrath. And look at verse 10. They shall go after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, his children shall come, trembling from the west. They shall come, trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria, and I will return them to their home, declares the Lord. I will bring them back. You're not going to go to Egypt. You're going to go to Assyria, but I will bring you back. In other words, he's saying, there was an exodus once, but behold, I'm going to have a second exodus, a new exodus. You guys follow me? If there's going to be a second exodus, there has to be a second Moses. And in fact, if you turn back earlier in Hosea chapter 1, look at Hosea 1. It says, and the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, one leader. And they shall go up from the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. There's going to be a leader that they appoint, and they're going to follow that leader out of the land, it says. Go to chapter 2, verse 14 and 15. Therefore I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. And there I will give her her vineyards and make the valley of Achor a door of hope. And there she shall answer as in the days of her youth, as at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. When they came out of the land of Egypt, that's the first exodus. He says, Israel's going to respond to me like in the days of her youth. There's going to be a second exodus. Chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. Hosea 3, verses 4 and 5. For the children of Israel shall dwell many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or household gods. That's right now, by the way. Verse 5, afterward, after that period of time, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they shall come in fear to the Lord and to his goodness in the latter days. So there's going to be this leader who is like a new David. Jesus is the son of David, the King of Kings, isn't he? It's going to be a new Moses, and by the way, Moses said in Deuteronomy 18, there will be a prophet who comes after me. God will raise up a prophet like me. You shall listen to him. In the New Testament, we see that they understood that prophecy to be about the Messiah. The Messiah is the prophet who's to come. The Messiah is the new David. The Messiah is the new Moses who's going to come and deliver his people in a new exodus. That's the idea here. There's going to be a new exodus. In fact, if you're in Hosea, turn back to Isaiah. I just want you to see this because to me, it's so cool when the Bible all fits together. I don't know about you, but I love that. It gets me going in the morning. So Isaiah 43. Isaiah 43, listen to these words. In verses 16 to 21. Again, remember, the backdrop of this is Exodus is a big deal. Exodus is a big deal. You're saved from Egypt. You're saved from slavery to Egypt. Remember the Passover. Do the Passover. But now look at Isaiah 43, verses 16 to 21. Thus says the Lord, who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters, who brings forth chariot and horse, army and warrior. They lie down, they cannot rise, they are extinguished, quenched like a wick. What's he referring to? He's talking about the Exodus. Path through the waters, the chariots are all overthrown. That's the Exodus. Verse 18, remember not the former things, nor consider the things of old. Huh? Don't remember them. Verse 19, behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. You're not even going to remember the old Exodus anymore because I'm doing a new thing. I'm doing a new thing. Turn another book to the right to Jeremiah, Jeremiah 16. We get similar words here. Jeremiah 16, verses 14 to 15. Jeremiah 16, verses 14 to 15. He says, "Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it shall no longer be said, as the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt. But as the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the north country and out of all the countries where he had driven them. For I will bring them back to their own land that I gave to their fathers." So there's a day coming when you're going to forget the Exodus. There's a day coming when you're going to say the Exodus is no big deal, and instead you're going to say, the Lord, as the Lord lives, who brought us up out of the north country, out of all the countries that we'd been scattered to. The north country being Assyria specifically. Assyria and Babylon. He's saying there is a new Exodus coming. So this is what's so cool. Alistair Roberts and Andrew Wilson, they wrote a book called Echoes of Exodus. And they say this: the prophets keep calling Israel to remember the Exodus, not in nostalgia for a golden past, but in hope for the future. Israel worships the God of the Exodus, the God who may appear silent, but who hears the cry of his people and who is quietly preparing to liberate them from captivity with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So when all seems to be lost, there is hope. I love that last line. When all seems to be lost, there is hope. Why remember the Exodus? Why remember these words, out of Egypt I called my son? Because history gives hope. God did it once, he will do it again. God delivered Israel in a first Exodus, he will deliver them in a greater second Exodus. With a greater Moses, with a greater David, with a greater prophet, it is the Lord Jesus Christ. And so when the New Testament when the Old Testament ends, they're looking for a Messiah. You didn't realize this is a Christmas sermon. Haha, snuck it in. The Old Testament ends looking for a Messiah, looking for the David, looking for this Moses, this new hope. They're waiting and waiting and waiting. And so the third point, the provision of salvation in the new Exodus. The provision of salvation in the new Exodus. And here we get to Matthew 2:15 again. In Matthew 2, what's going on here? In Matthew 2:15, it says, "This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son." Now let me ask you, when you read that in Hosea 11:1, did that sound like a prophecy? Did that sound like, hey, one day Jesus is coming? No, it's not a prophecy. That's not what it means to fulfill this prophecy. See, we often think of like telling the future and then fulfillment. But actually, the New Testament talks about fulfillment in different ways. There's a sense in which Jesus fulfilled the ultimate purpose of the Exodus. Do you follow me? The old Exodus, the first Exodus, created a pattern. It created a pattern. And now Jesus fulfills that pattern by being the true Moses, the true David, fulfilling the true Exodus. You guys follow me? So this was fulfillment not of direct prophecy, but this is fulfillment of a pattern. Fulfillment of a pattern. This is the Exodus that was always meant to be. Jesus is a lot like Moses, and he's a lot like Israel in a sense. Jesus, there's this idea, and I'm going to try not to be too nerdy on this. There's this term called corporate solidarity. Okay, if you don't want to remember that, don't worry about it. All it means is a king represents his people. A king represents his people. David was willing to lay down his life for his people. Moses was willing to say, God, blot out my name and forgive the people. The leader comes to represent his people. Jesus represents Israel here. Jesus is the true Israelite. Jesus is the greatest Israelite. Jesus is the one true Israelite who represents all of Israel. And so when it says, out of Egypt I called my son, this isn't so much saying that that Hosea 11:1 is about him. It's about Israel, but Jesus comes to fulfill what Israel was meant to do. And in doing so, this now says, hey, this mention of Exodus from Egypt, this is Matthew's way of saying the new Exodus is coming. The new Moses is here. And Israel's about to be delivered for real this time. Spiritually, eternally, forever. You guys follow me? And so Jesus is that true Israel. Jesus is also the true Moses. Remember Moses? When he was born, an evil king tried to kill all the baby boys. Remember that? Just like Herod tried to kill all the baby boys. Moses would go and receive the law on a mountain. Jesus would give the Sermon on the Mount from a mountain. You have all these parallels between Jesus and Moses, and it's not by accident. It is by design because Jesus is the new Moses, the new David with the new Passover. And I want to show you one more passage here in Luke 9. We're running out of time, so I'm going to do this real quick. Luke 9. This is just so neat. Luke 9:31. It's the Mount of Transfiguration where Jesus meets Moses and Elijah. And in Luke 9:31, I want you to see what it says here. On the Mount of Transfiguration, it says that Moses and Elijah appeared in glory and spoke of his departure. Right? The two men were talking with Jesus, and they spoke of Jesus' departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, if you look in your Bible, the word departure, do you have a footnote there? Maybe you see a footnote? What does it say at the bottom? What does it say? Exodus. He was talking with Moses and Elijah on the mountain about the exodus that he was about to accomplish. See, Jesus was coming to deliver his people, not from Egypt, not from Assyria, but from sin, slavery to sin, from the wrath of God, from the judgment of God itself. This is what's going on here. And so, history gives hope. God did it once, and he did it again in a greater way. And so there's this beauty to the scriptures that throughout there are prophecies about the Messiah, but there are patterns that Jesus fulfills. And it's this beautiful, wondrous, amazing thing. And so, okay, now what do we do with all that? As New Testament believers, you remember Jesus, the night he was betrayed, what were they celebrating? Passover, which is about the Exodus. But now he says, from now on, you're going to celebrate the Lord's table. You're going to celebrate communion in remembrance of me. You're not going to remember the lamb and the Passover lamb. You're going to remember me. You know, some scholars have commented that when we get the accounts of the Last Supper, they talk about the bread, they talk about the wine. But what's missing if it's a true Passover meal? What's missing if it's the true Passover meal? The lamb. There's no mention of lamb. Why? Because Jesus is the lamb. And that's what it says in 1 Corinthians 5:7. Jesus is our Passover lamb, and he has been slain. Jesus is the Passover lamb. In Exodus 12, it doesn't say, now this lamb is going to be a prophecy of Jesus. It's a pattern that's fulfilled in Jesus, the true Passover lamb. And for those who are reading the scriptures carefully, you're waiting for the lamb, you're waiting for the Moses, you're waiting for the David, and it all comes together in one person. That's the amazing nature here. And so, what do we do with this? 3 applications. Remember Christ. That's why we take communion. They were an Old Testament, they were an Exodus-centered people in Israel. We are a cross-centered, Christ-centered people today. We don't celebrate Passover, we celebrate communion to remember Christ crucified and risen. So remember Christ. And because of Christ, there is always hope. There's hope beyond the grave because Jesus rose from the dead. Secondly, repent of sin. 1 Corinthians 5:7 says, Christ, our Passover lamb, has been slain. Therefore, put away all sin. Flee from all leaven. Just as Israel had to put away the sins of Egypt when they fled, we put away sin because Christ, our Passover lamb, has been slain. That's why we say to examine yourself when we take communion. And lastly, recount the gospel. Recount the gospel. Proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. That's what we do in communion, which we will do in just a moment. Remember Christ, repent of sin, recount the gospel.